Understanding the 5 stages of grief. Grief is a complex cycle that comes with many stages and separate experiences that can keep us overwhelmed by the complexities of dealing with the loss of a significant relationship or situation. It can be very scary for somebody who has never experienced grief to be stuck in the different stages of their grieving, and it can make them volatile and hostile. Everybody grieves in different ways and may not even experience the stages of grief in the same order. However, what can be agreed upon is that despite how difficult it may seem for us to move forward once we have been unexpectedly hit with the difficulties of a significant loss, is that at some point, we will find our peace with acceptance. Unfortunately, this is usually the last stage of grief that we arrive at, and we can quickly jump from acceptance right back to denial and back again. Grief is tricky and can take quite a while for us to process. The biggest thing we can do to help ourselves through this process is to understand as much about grief as we possibly can and be patient and forgiving of ourselves as we deal with the issues that are frequently associated with grieving and loss. Taking this course shows that you are already aware of the responsibilities that you have toward yourself and your own healing. That is a step that is very admirable, and it takes a lot of inner strength and courage. If you are having a hard time with your grief, that can oftentimes be difficult simply to articulate and admit, let alone seeking resources to help you. Congratulations on making it this far. You are stronger than you think you are. Now, let's start to discuss the 5 stages of grief. The stage that often comes first is denial. When we hear the horrible news, our automatic response is to deny what we have heard because we do not want to accept that it is true. We don't even want to think that it could be possible. When we are confronted with a terrible situation that feels much more like a nightmare than it feels like our reality, we want to run and hide as far away from that reality as possible. This is when we go into denial. It can be a very trying stage for you, as well as other people who are connected to the situation, but may be experiencing different stages of the grief cycle. When you are feeling like the news you have just heard is too terrible to be true, and you check out of reality for a little while, it can be frustrating to others who are angry about the loss or depressed about the loss to reiterate the fact that yes, it really is happening, and there is nothing more to be said or done about it, no matter how hard you try. The next stage of grief is anger. When things hurt us unexpectedly, it's pretty common that we get angry about it. We don't want to just lie down and take it when things are painful. Usually there is someone alive and malicious out there who is causing us harm, so our natural reflex seems to be anger. Whether we are angry at the subject of our loss for leaving or angry at others for how they are treating the loss, the end feeling is the same. When we are angry at our loss, we are generally asking ourselves why such a terrible thing has happened to us. It may seem unfair, undeserved, and agitating to know that we are suffering for some unknown reason, or even for no reason whatsoever. But our minds need to try to make sense of everything that happens to us, and when we can't find the correlation between cause and effect, that can make us feel helpless, which makes us feel even angrier. We like to be in control, and losing control never feels very good, especially when what we are trying to control is out of our hands and the hands of everybody else. Things like death can be especially infuriating when we are trying to maintain structure and control in our lives. The third stage of grief is bargaining. Bargaining occurs when we have allowed the idea of the loss to sink in for a few moments, but it is still so profoundly difficult for us to handle that we feel we will do anything to reverse the negative effects of the situation we are in. We will make promises we can't keep and offer to be completely different or better people if some higher power with more control than we have will just take mercy upon us. When we are swept up in grief, we often feel like we would do anything possible to make the bad feelings that we are having go away. Unfortunately, most of the time, loss that inspires grief is irreversible. Sure, we may grieve the loss of a friendship or relationship that could eventually be repaired if both parties are mature enough. But a lot of the time when we grieve, It is because of events beyond our control that can't be reversed. When we are grieving a death, for example, it is impossible to reverse the effects. We can make any promises to the powers that be that we can think of, but it still will not change the end result of our loss. The fourth stage of grief, and often the most long-lasting and common stage, is depression. When we are dealing with the results of grief in our lives, it can be easy to sink into a state of depression and unhappiness that can leave us immobile. Depression is a state that can freeze us and prevent us from moving forward. If we get stuck too long into painful states of depression, we may lose sight of what makes life worth living and begin to degrade our quality of life. Depression is difficult to move through because we don't want to move at all. Most of the time, depression leaves us slow and unmotivated. We would rather lie in bed and feel terrible than get up and do the things that are expected of us. Sometimes that's okay. It can be what we need to take a break from the responsibilities of our everyday lives so that we can take the time we need to begin to mentally and emotionally process our loss. However, it can be a slippery slope. Sure, we can justify being depressed for a week or two after a shocking loss, but if that depression persists for too long, it can become a chronic state that will be discussed in a later section. Chronic depression can all but destroy our lives and the stability that we struggle to build. And if we allow ourselves to dwell in this dangerous emotional state, it can have everlasting consequences. Fortunately, while we are grieving, the depression stage doesn't always throw us for a loop. We can be depressed in a healthy way and allow ourselves to process the difficult emotions that are plaguing us. If we allow ourselves to move successfully through the individual stages of grief, even if we skip a few or even all of them, and make it to acceptance of the situation relatively unscathed, then we will not have to worry about depression impacting us for the rest of our lives. But because this stage of grief can be so all-encompassing, it will be discussed more in depth later in the course. The final stage of depression is acceptance. Acceptance can be something that we need to work very hard for, especially when we are struggling through the other four stages of grief. It may take quite a few cycles before we reach a permanent state of acceptance. A lot of people might think that the cycles of grief are an easy list that we all experience one by one in perfect order until we reach the end, but unfortunately that is not the case. There are many times when acceptance cannot be reached permanently until the cycles of grief have been experienced several times over, sometimes very out of order. But that is okay, because we are all individuals who require different emotional processes before we're able to move forward with our lives. Emotions can be very complicated, and it isn't wrong of us to take our time to process feelings that are extremely difficult. Eventually, we will arrive at acceptance, even if it takes a while. When we are able to reach acceptance of the difficulty of our loss, then we find ourselves at peace with what has happened to us. That doesn't mean that thinking about it won't cause us pain. In fact, sometimes the loss of a loved one will always pain us. But we can go from being so overwhelmed by grief when we think of them to finally being able to smile and remember the wonderful things about having them in our lives, even if we are smiling through our tears. Acceptance simply means that we are at peace with the fact that the loss has happened, and in finding that peace, we are able to move on from the overwhelming and seemingly insurmountable grief in order to continue living our lives to the best of our abilities. When we are able to cope with our loss, then we are able to move forward and continue to create harmony and peace in other aspects of our life.